Hello and welcome to episode 251 of the Money to the Masses podcast with me, your resident expert, Damien Fay, and alas, no Andy Leaks. Now, we seem to be taking it in turns to miss the podcast, although last week's absence by me was due to illness. I'm only just getting over that. You can probably hear it in my voice, so I apologise for my croakiness. But for Andy, the good news is he's moved house, so you may have picked up some of the saga over the last, it feels like about a year, that Andy's been trying to move into his new house. So he's got the keys, he's excited, he's been off for the week doing that just before Christmas, just in time, so congratulations to Andy. And I thought what I would do is I would take it upon myself to do a podcast that a lot of you have been wanting to hear. Now, some time ago, probably at the beginning of the summer, I told people about a fraud that had occurred. I'd become a victim of fraud through no fault of my own, and there was an incredible amount of incompetence by a bank involved, in fact more than one bank involved, that I wanted to tell people about, warn them about, because it was something that even to this day, if you're listening to this podcast, you could become a victim of it tomorrow. There's nothing you can do to stop it. I could become a victim of it again tomorrow, but I'm going to give you some tips on how you might be able to try and prevent it. But it's fundamentally a problem with our banking system and the way banks work at the moment that saw me lose about £4,000 of money, have £4,000 of money stolen from my children's savings account, which was mostly inheritance from grandparents that was designated for them. So it was something that I couldn't stop, but I want to tell you the story. That's why it doesn't need Andy's involvement. So sit down, get a cup of tea and listen to this, because there's a lot of learnings from this particular podcast that you will want to take in. So the story started back in the early summer, and I was going for a extension on my mortgage because I wanted to do some home improvements on my house, and to do that required me to get an extension on my mortgage with my existing lender. Now, like any type of borrowing, when you go there, you have to provide details of your earnings, your bank statements, and bits and pieces. So as part of that due diligence and me preparing for a meeting with the lender to be able to secure the extra borrowing I needed to be able to improve my kitchen and bathroom, I discovered a fraud on a completely unrelated account. Now, I'm not going to name the bank / building society involved in this at the moment. I'm going to just tell people the story. And what happened, while putting all together all the details, I regularly check my bank accounts. I'm a little bit OCD like that, but it's also the reason I do it is for the sole purpose of trying to spot fraudulent activity. I've had it in the past where I've seen somebody up in Doncaster buy £100 of mobile phones, and if you don't check your transactions, especially when you have joint accounts with your partner who are buying things throughout the month like everybody does, you're both using the same cards or your own cards for the same account, you won't always know or recognise transactions. So I tend to look at them and go through them. However, I do have an old account which I have always used for the purposes of saving money for my children. Now, we're talking very small amounts, £10 a month type of stuff. And it's part of the reason I had to do that was it was an old account I had, and I never used it. No money ever went in, or I never used the debit card on this particular account. It was largely dormant, but the money would drop into it via bank transfers, standing orders each month from my main account, and then that money would be used to be able to fund children's savings accounts, some regular children's savings account with this same institution. Now, I happened, as part of my work that I was doing to pull stuff together for this mortgage application, I thought I'll go and look at the account over there, see what's happening, and I'll print some stuff out just in case they want to know anything else about any other accounts I have. And on doing so, I suddenly noticed that the account that should have had a zero balance and that had an obligatory £500 overdraft was sitting at minus £490. And of course, alarm bells started ringing in my head. When I looked, the associated children's savings accounts, so you can't draw money out of these accounts, they're associated with it. So they're in my children's names, but I am the trustee. Those accounts I could see had been emptied. And in there, between the two accounts, like I say, were gifts from when the children were inheritance, when grandparents want to pay a bit of pocket money. And of course, my oldest child is nearly 10. So between the two accounts, there was almost £4,000 in there, or there should have been, I say, because it had disappeared. And when I looked into the accounts, I could see that there had been withdrawals made on each of these accounts, significant sums on a couple of days. So we're talking about £700-800 each time. Now, you will know as well as I do, you can't draw out £800 out of a cash machine, but as I said, these accounts were actually savings accounts, so something had gone awry. So immediately I kicked into gear and I rang up the bank, and I'm going to give you the shortened version of this, because in order to solve the problems that occurred by the fault of the bank, I probably spent about 10 hours over the space of weeks and almost months trying to resolve this. But to give you a succinct version of what happened, when I rang them up, they looked at the current account that I didn't use, that was in a minus £496 state. Somebody had withdrawn money. They obviously said, well, was that you? I said, no, of course it wasn't me. So we then went through the whole process of being passed to various departments to try and report the fraud and cancel it. What happened, it turns out, is that this account I do not use. The card for that account I still had. In fact, it was at home, and I've never ever used it. Somebody had intercepted a new card that was being sent out on that account. So if you look at your card, of any card you've got on your wallet or purse, there'll be the expiry date. And as you approach that expiry date, a bank or building society will usually send you a card, a replacement card. The problem is, and this is one of the big number one failings of the banks, is that they send them out in ordinary post. And it's not special delivery or recorded delivery, so they sent them out. And they sent this card out, and then a subsequent PIN number for that card, and nobody knows quite why they did that. They sent out both of these items, and they appear to have been intercepted. Now, I don't know that the PIN number was ever intercepted, but I know the card was, because I never received it. And it was due to expire about a few days, well, the card was due to expire a couple of days after this fraud occurred. So they'd sent me out a card in the post. I didn't know they'd sent me out a card in the post. They hadn't informed me in any way. This card had been stolen by somebody. When the bank then looked at the children's accounts, they worked out that what had happened is the person with just my bank card, so that's all they knew about me. They had this debit card for this current account that had no money in it. They then took that current account and went into a bank branch, in fact 2 bank branches in London. They went in there and presented it to, this is what I've been told or has been assumed has happened. They had presented it to somebody in branch. The branch, after a lengthy investigation, has never been able to confirm exactly what happened. They won't be able to provide CCTV details or anything like that, of not being able to. They believe the person gave them the PIN number, and if you go into a branch, their protocol, this particular bank, which is apparently not unusual, is that if you go into a bank, present a debit card, and you can put the PIN number in, then you are good to go, and they will tell you anything about that account. Now, the first thing to highlight about that, there's no checks that the person was me. In fact, they never denied the fact that if it had been a woman who'd gone in and had my card, they would have even challenged them. It was the fact they knew the PIN number and they had the card. With that information, apparently the branch staff facilitated them to know everything about that account and everything about the associated accounts, which they had no idea existed at that point. You bear in mind they just got a debit card. So they then obviously see these 2 children's savings accounts, their eyes must have lit up, and then they proceeded to request withdrawals from those accounts. And of course, the bank couldn't facilitate all of those withdrawals on the same day. They can only use limits. So what they did is they then went, with that information, they then went to another branch, went there, asked them to empty the children's accounts. They then went back the next day, did the same thing again, and they went on this merry-go-round until they'd exhausted all the money from the accounts. The point at which I had discovered the fraud was on one of the final days when they were trying to withdraw money from the children's accounts, that I rang up the bank and they put a freeze on everything. They froze the accounts. Now, the big thing is, obviously, nobody had told me this had occurred. No one had flagged it. I mean, the most basic computer systems that are supposed to check fraud, you would think that if there was a single transaction on an account that had never been used, alarm bells would have gone off. I mean, my 3-year-old could have worked that out. So they never did raise any alarms. I was the one who spotted the fraud. I rang them up, spoke to them. We spent a long time going round and round in circles. Now, the ridiculousness of the whole scenario is that in this particular bank, it's one of the biggest in the UK, they have different departments for different frauds. So for my current account, they said, look, the transactions and the money being taken out, we can refund that. We know that wasn't you. But the children's money that's been taken out, they effectively said, we're not sure that's not you. So what we've got to do is do an investigation that will take up to 2 weeks, at which point we'll tell you the conclusion of that investigation, and then we'll make a decision on what we're going to do about the money. Of course, you can imagine I then hit the roof, because they were saying that effectively weren't accusing me of taking money out, but they wanted to try and work out if I'd done it. Interestingly, in amongst all of this, I then went on to high alert and started to realise that these people had gone in with no information about me bar a card, but the bank had given them access to far more information than they had themselves. So they'd been provided with more information. I then realised, while I was on the phone to the bank for about the umpteenth time on that same day, well, with that information, they can then start to use that to commit fraud and take out credit in my name. So I went and checked my credit report. Now, this isn't a plug for a particular credit company or a credit reporting company, but I've used Credit Karma. It's free. It's very quick and easy to use. And so I went on there, logged on straight away. I'd already checked my credit report previously. So the account was all set up, went in there, and immediately I could see that somebody with the same bank had performed a credit check on me. And now at no point had the bank even acknowledged or even realised this had occurred. This is how ridiculous the situation had got. They committed the fraud on the current account. They then took the money out of my children's accounts. They then, apparently, in realising that they weren't going to get any more money out of the current account because they'd hit their overdraft limit, they had requested an overdraft extension. And so not only that, the extension was over £1,000 in size. So nobody at any point in any of this had twigged what they'd done. So therefore, a credit check, a mark on my credit report had occurred because of the bank's failings. But they hadn't even spotted this. It was me just being more clued up than the average person, realising what the implications could be and then spotting it. They then went and obviously looked at it, had another investigation ongoing. There were 3 departments dealing with this. There's a department, this is ridiculous, a department for credit, a department for branch fraud, and a department for current account fraud. This is one of the biggest banks in the UK, banking groups I should say, and there is no discussion between each of them. I was having to raise complaints and have different procedures and reference numbers with each of these. Now, to stress the ridiculousness of the situation, you have to remember that when I opened up my children's savings accounts, I had to go in with War and Peace to be able to do it. Proofs of ID for me, proofs of identity for my children, and the money and everything to be able to do anything with it. Seemingly, it was easier for them to take the money out. They didn't have to have any of that, proof of ID or anything, than I did when I put the money in. It's far easier just to steal money than to deposit it. How have we got to a situation like this? So immediately we got to a situation where my accounts were put into lockdown. Ironically, this wasn't particularly helpful because what it did is it meant I couldn't see anything online. So I couldn't see anything that was going on, whether I was getting refunded or not. The banks refused to call me to inform me when the refunds on the current account had been made, etc., etc. And I was stuck in 2 weeks of limbo, waiting for them to carry out an investigation. What I did though, and I advise anybody in the same situation to do, is obviously you're going to report the fraud, and you can report the fraud to the police as well, because then you get a crime reference number. But one of the first things, think about yourself, is if somebody has potentially information about you, they can take credit out. I was worried that they were going to be able to take credit elsewhere. So I took out a CIFAS, C-I-F-A-S. And now, that might not be how you say it, but what it does, for £25 for 2 years, it basically puts a mark on your credit report, whereby it makes it harder for people to commit fraud. Because what will happen is when somebody goes to take out credit in your name, the banks and building societies or credit lenders will have to carry out more checks because there's been this warning that you might be a victim of fraud. Now, of course, that's a problem for me anyway, because it means I'm going to have to probably do a little bit more if I want to take out credit in the future, but it's about safety. So that's the first thing I did, because it meant that I could be comfortable as I could be that it might limit the damage that these people could do. Because at this point, I still didn't, and I still to this day do not know what information these people were given. Because if we jump forward to then what happened after the investigation, 2 weeks went by, and it turns out that the way they investigate these things is they send an email to the branch. They say, oh, something happened over there. Can you tell me what happened? No response. Chase them again, no response. The branch never responded, effectively. That is the answer. So in light of no response, they deemed that I must not have been a crook. Obviously, what we'll do is just give you the money back. And they refunded the money that was stolen. Now, the issue is that I still do not have confirmation, and I've protested about this, that it wasn't a member of staff. There is no evidence to suggest that it wasn't a member of staff who committed the fraud and couldn't repeat it again and again, because no procedures have changed. So we got through the phase where they decided that they were going to refund the money to me. And as far as the bank was concerned, I should be fairly happy with that. But of course, they were about to send out another card to me. And I was like, whoa, what are you doing? I don't want you to send any more cards. Because that's the other thing to bear in mind. If you have a dormant account, or not say a dormant one you don't use regularly, you don't use the debit card, you can ask not to have it sent to you. And I would advise people to do that. I've done it. So don't send me cards. I don't want to send a card. Because sometimes you just use the online functionality of an account. You don't worry so much about the ability to be able to draw money out of the holes in the wall, the ATMs. So that was it. The bank was washing their hands of it. Of course, I wasn't happy about this. And the lessons that I want people to take from this story is there were a number of failings from the bank, and therefore your right and your ability to make a complaint. So there'd been a host of incompetencies in terms of how they'd investigated the fraud, how they had enabled it to happen in the first place by sending out a card without any protection, how they'd allowed an overdraft to be requested. And this is the other point that I've not mentioned. They requested an overdraft, the fraudsters. I told them, do not approve that in any way, shape or form. What do you think the bank did after they paid me the money and thought everything was done? Yes, of course, they approved it. So I had a huge overdraft on my account. So I'd taken out credit that I didn't want, even though I told the bank that was the case and they knew it, they still approved it. So that obviously did then start to impact my credit rating because I'm taking out more and more credit. Now, that was obviously a problem. The other thing that I actually didn't mention was the fraudsters rang the bank at some point to discuss the overdraft they were trying to take and have failed a few checks. But the bank never called me to tell me that had occurred. So the bank was just, well, it's one of those things. So everyone has rights. So what I did is I pulled together all the various failings that I thought had happened in this particular case. So they hadn't notified me of the suspicious behaviour. They didn't contact me. They must have given data out to these people, or at least told them about the savings accounts, as there was no way they would have known. Don't forget, these accounts are my children's accounts. They're not associated with that debit card. You can't access the money in those accounts using that debit card. The branch didn't even respond to requests for CCTV. Ironically, if you'd gone in there and actually tried to rob a bank, I'm sure they would have found some CCTV footage. It's a case of they're not really bothered about the fraud. It's one of those things they tend to think, well, we'll just resolve it if we can and not investigate it. And they thought I should be happy I get my money back. Now, obviously, I wasn't happy about what happened, because I'd been left with a mark on my credit reports for the search for the credit, but also an extension to my overdraft, which I didn't want. They also had in any way compensated me for the hassle, the problems, the stress, and the phone calls from me having to call them. I mean, for me, that was not really the point, but it was more about the other areas that they'd basically failed. So I made an official complaint. And as you would expect me to, bearing in mind that I ironically, having worked in the banking system years ago, you get to know what the rules are. And now, of course, you can make an official complaint over the phone, you can do it in email, you can do it by letter. I prefer to do it by letter, because what we had is a scenario where we had different departments all resolving each part of their complaint in isolation. So we had the card transaction people saying, well, I've done the card transaction, you should be happy. The people who are dealing with the in-branch fraud said, well, we did what we could, not much more we can do. We had the people who were dealing with the overdraft and the credit fraud. Well, they didn't really do anything in the end other than fail to stop it. But The point is, no one had a holistic view of it, of what had happened and the failings of the bank. So I therefore made a complaint. And I know if you make a complaint, the bank has 8 weeks to respond. And if you put it all formally down and make a note, whenever you have a scenario like this, I was diligent in writing down the time I rang somebody, asking for their name. Don't just take their first name, take their second name and where they work. Write down when you began the call, when it finished, how long it was, because they will go back and listen to these calls if you make a complaint, because the calls are recorded. Now, by doing that and keeping a diarised format, I didn't realise quite how long and long-winded this fraud case would be. And in the end, it amounted to like dozens of hours of being wasted on the phone and talking to an array of people. Obviously, the complaint got more and more escalated and eventually got to the top of the tree when I put in a formal complaint after about 6 weeks of all this going on. And I put it all together, and the reason I did it in a letter was because it pulls together the information and gives you a chronological version of events. And the lessons I learned from this, like I said, I want you to take away, is that you should diarise when you're going to get new cards. So every card in your wallet, if you're going to do nothing else today, put a diary note. So put in your calendar about a couple of weeks before, 3-4 weeks before it's due to end, put an alarm to say my whatever bank account is due to send out a new debit card. Because if somebody intercepts it, you won't know. If I had realised somebody had intercepted it, maybe I could have stopped the fraud earlier before it occurred. And it's all about prevention. The next thing is check your bank regularly, and you never trust your bank to resolve the issue properly. Now, this is a part of the story which I haven't mentioned as yet, and this one is quite incredible, to be honest with you. When the bank starts to try and solve a problem, you have to think one step ahead of them and how their actions could have implications. Now, if you remember earlier in the podcast, I mentioned they froze my account. Now, this bank is part of a big banking group. By coincidence, I have another account with a completely different bank within that banking group. Now, when they froze my account for this, I'll call it Bank A, their Bank B, within the same banking group, another one of the big high street names, they froze that account. But there was no one told me they had. In fact, I could log in online, everything looked normal, there were no messages, nobody told me, there was no way of knowing the bank had been frozen. That particular bank account had. It's a separate bank, why should it be? And I didn't give them permission to do it. How I found out that it was, and luckily it didn't cause me a potential problem, was because where I move money between accounts, I talk about big picture budgeting, you've heard me do it before. Day after payday, I move money between my accounts by standing order into pots. Now, I moved money into this account, and what happened is it bounced back, and my bank, the one that was where my wages get paid into, notified me and said that your standing order bounced. I thought, that's odd, my standing order's bounced. So I rang up this Bank B, this one that's completely not associated with this fraud, rang them up and said, what happened there? It bounced. I tried to pay money in. Said, there's nothing wrong. Cut a long story short, it turns out the bank account had been frozen. And if it hadn't been for me being diligent and pursuing this, I had a credit card direct debit. I pay credit cards by direct debit so you don't default on them and wreck your credit rating, because it really does. If I hadn't have noticed, 2 days later my credit card direct debit would have bounced, because they confirmed to me that it would have cancelled that direct debit because the account had been frozen. So if it wasn't for me being diligent and checking the implications or finding them out by just basically, that was partly due to due diligence but also fortune that my own standing orders bounced, double checking what the implication of that lockdown was, I would have defaulted on my credit card, and that would have wrecked my credit rating, which wouldn't have been particularly great. Now imagine this is all happening, or the initial discovery happened the day before I was meant to be going to see a mortgage guy. Now, that is obviously stressful enough, but I knew enough to know that it wouldn't have an implication on that decision, and it didn't for me, so I was able to still borrow the money that I needed. But you have to be, as an individual, very diligent and basically thinking, not trusting your bank. Do not trust your bank to solve this problem. I don't care whether it's an old bank, a new bank. The problem is with the technology, they shut down one, it went across the board. As soon as there are different departments dealing with issues, you have a department that can freeze things, a department that deals with banking or credit. As soon as that happens, and that happens with every bank, the departments don't talk and things collapse. So eventually that got unfrozen. So don't trust your bank. If you understand the complaints procedure and your rights to redress, then you can make a complaint and ultimately you can go to the Ombudsman. Now, obviously, the other thing I just want to quickly mention before I talk about the Ombudsman is obviously checking your credit report, because you need to make sure you do that regularly, because you would see any credit checks that are happening anywhere else. So if I hadn't done my mortgage application, would I have noticed? I would have done eventually, because at some point I probably would have been refused credit, but I would have checked that account within the next week or so anyway. But if you don't check accounts regularly, then you could be a victim of fraud and not realise it. But if you check your credit report, which I do regularly, you will therefore start to see those credit checks appear. Of course, you're probably all thinking, this is unbelievable, and I must have gone ballistic at them. I've pursued the complaint on numerous grounds about the way the fraud occurred, the incompetence on various levels, including freezing accounts that they shouldn't have done, all various things. And ultimately, by pursuing it and knowing what your rights are and demanding that they put things right and change things, that they actually apologised for the incident and then compensated me. And I don't mind telling you how much they gave me. It was best part of £500. Now, the money is irrelevant. I'd rather not have £500 and not had the hassle that had occurred. Now, the next stage, the reason I'm telling you this story now, because it's come to a suitable almost end. My next point could be, if I'm not happy with the way that the decision's been made with my complaint, I could go to the Ombudsman. Now, one of the issues that the complaints process wasn't adhered to correctly really anyway, because there were multiple people involved in the complaint and they were overlapping. You need to know when you start a complaint when the date of the start is and when the end point is of the sort of 8-week windows, so everyone sticks to them. So make sure you do, because this bank kept trying to move them and they're not allowed to. So I made them stick to their time frames that they have to legally. But the Ombudsman is an interesting one, because while you can go and complain to them, they principally deal with things that have been treated unfairly, largely when it comes to things like charges, being overcharged and stuff like that. In this instance, I think it would be whether my still biggest gripe and the thing I'm not happy about is the procedures and the way the banking system works. And that's a much bigger thing. That's not the Ombudsman's not going to solve that. Their view would more likely be that I was compensated and eventually things were put right. The strangest thing I have to add to this, that I was told that you need to open up new children's accounts because obviously the old ones were compromised. But I can't do that online. They won't do it for me. I've got to go into a bank to open up new children's accounts with this bank, which is ludicrous. So I have to do more than what the fraudsters did. I have to provide evidence and everything like that. So do you think I'm going to do that? Well, of course I'm not even for 1 second going to continue banking with them. But with the Ombudsman, it's more about looking at whether your complaint was handled correctly and whether it was fairly. Obviously, for the wider issue, I take particular annoyance at the way banks still send out your details in the post without recorded delivery or registered post. The only reason they do that, and I'll argue till I'm blue in the face about it, is cost cutting, and they must see it as just do you know what, the amount of fraud we get as a result pays off. Ultimately, we'll pay for that through charges. So any fraud that the bank compensates us for, we're paying for that ultimately. I think they should be forced to change that and protect our data. They don't really care. Of course, my other wider thing is about the fact they didn't investigate what went on in the branch. They don't really seem to care. They deem it, if the branch doesn't really respond, they don't take it seriously enough on an individual level, or about what potential information they could take, and also the future impact something like this can have. Had my credit report been completely wrecked, would that impact my future ability to take out credit? I now have to obviously do more to get credit because of the CFAS I now have. But one of the big things I'd have to mention as well, that I almost forgot there, was that on the credit report part, I insisted as part of my complaint that they had to rectify my credit report. And that's important as part of the process. They had to rectify my credit report and remove the searches that were on there, and also remove the overdraft, because that was another part of the complaint. Even at the point where they thought they'd done everything and we were all happy and told me to go away, I still had an enormous overdraft I didn't request that they'd approved fraudulently themselves. So that was all ultimately is rectified, and you have to pursue that because they weren't going to do it and offer it themselves. You have to know what your rights are. So the moral of this whole story is that it doesn't matter who you are, what you do as a job, how diligent you are, you will become a victim of fraud at some point. And it will likely, even if you're particularly diligent, it means that it's probably going to be not your fault either. It's something that you can't stop. And it's about knowing what to do quickly to try and limit the damage, not trusting what your bank says, and then looking after yourself, and more importantly, realising the potential impact in the future and trying to negate it. So I hope you've all learned from that. I don't mind sharing these personal stories because they provide a lesson. I don't feel stupid about what happened, is what I'm trying to say. You should never feel stupid from falling victim to fraud. There are just lessons in everything like this. You have to look for the silver linings and then try and share them with people. That is it for this week's podcast. I think I've covered everything in that story. I tried to keep it succinct because I could have talked about it for about 5 days, to be quite frank. If you want to get hold of me, you can the usual ways. Twitter, email, via Facebook. Do join that Facebook group. It's doing really well. People are loving it in there, and they're sharing their knowledge and asking some fantastic questions, and even sometimes simple questions which we need to be put in there and people to answer to help everybody. The final thing I'd like to say is have a fantastic Christmas, and I will see you on the other side in 2020. We've got a lot of plans for 2020 with Money to the Masses, and we just like to thank you for all your support throughout the year, coming to the events, sharing what we do, encouraging people to listen and go to Money to the Masses. So a quick thank you for all of that, and as I say, enjoy the festive period, and we'll see you on the other side, and Andy will return.